Good morning, Mrs. Edwards. Miss Mitchell.
I'm obliged. Good morning.
Good morning.
I want to ask you about something that I touched on yesterday, which was tropes or stereotyping. We don't need to worry about what the actual wording was, but you understand the concept that I'm speaking of. We saw in great detail the letter of instruction to Martin Graves, and you asked for an opinion to be provided. I see you as a whole as the Crown, providing an opinion, and I'll quote from it. We don't need to bring it up on screen, saying that you wanted an opinion on what was reasonable and justifiable, taking into account the requirement for the use of force to be necessary, accountable, proportionate, legal and ethical. So the full remit of questions about the requirement for the use of force. Now, yesterday we talked about the angry black man as a trope or a stereotype. And you said that when you read the police statements, you identified those stereotypes or tropes within that statement. Is that correct?
I think I would say that I was aware of them when I was reading them. I
Yes.
wasn't necessarily saying that that was a particular stereotype or that a stereotype was being given. I was aware of them as I was reading the statement.
And what was that awareness then?
That was a particular stereotype of the angry black man.
I see. So
I'm not necessarily saying that they were portraying that stereotype, just that I was aware of it when I was reading it.
So you're aware of that when you were reading it. What you were asking Mr. Graves to do was look at what was reasonable and justifiable. And as part of that, you were looking at the use of force. If the police officers were acting in assessing the risk in front of them, taking into account Mr. Bayo's skin colour, i.e. if the things said in those statements, those things that you could identify as that could be potential, they had the potential to be related to race, taking into account Mr. Bayo's skin colour, for example, in relation to the question of whether or not he might be a terrorist. There was a direct link with the colour of Mr. Bayo's skin and the possibility of terrorism, and taking into consideration the tropes like biggest man I've ever seen, superhuman strength, deranged with superhuman strength, he was massive and the biggest male I've ever seen. Ought that to have been explored in terms of whether or not racial bias affected the police in respect of their perceived risk when they attended and saw Mr. Bayo?
I think that's an area that potentially I could have explored with the OST expert. Whether he was the correct expert to explore those types of things, I'm not entirely sure. But we could have asked the questions. Whether I've got an answer that would have been out with his area of expertise, I don't know.
We saw how you took experts from one area and perhaps asked questions of other people. And yesterday, I think you agreed that it was a possibility that a race expert may have assisted you in the process of identifying racist stereotypes or racist tropes. Had you got such an expert report identifying racist stereotypes and racist tropes, would that again have assisted in any question about whether or not, when the police arrived, they were assessing the risk differently because Mr. Bayo was black?
Potentially that was an area that could have been explored.
And if that is potentially an area that could have been explored, would that have been a profitable area to explore?
I can't tell you that because I don't know what the results of that would have been.
Well, if this inquiry were to assess that there were racist stereotypes and tropes being used, if we take that on a hypothetical, and there was the slapping of someone to check whether or not they're breathing, if those tied into race issues, what then would be your answer?
I think that's a difficult thing for me to answer at this stage because it is hypothetical. I think I've agreed with you that that might have been something that we could have explored. And I think I've said also in my evidence that we were keen to follow everything, to get as much information as we could, and this is an area that we could have done that. Would it have made any final difference with regard to my assessment of evil intent? I don't think so. But so you're asking me, would it have made any difference? Would it have made any difference to the end result? I don't think so.
Well, I wasn't asking that, but in fact, I don't need to go into that area. Really, what I was wanting to take from you is, if part of the mens rea of someone thinking about something is affected by race, if their risk assessment is affected by race, is that something you should have considered when dealing with mens rea? And if not, why not?
I think when we were looking at the risk assessment, as much as possible, I was looking at what was in the minds of the officers, so their evil intent. So the evil intent, I suppose, motivation, and why, if we did find evil intent, the next question would be why? Why was there evil intent? So I think when I was looking at the statements and as much as I could what was in the minds of the officers, I was looking at all that with a background of what we've already talked about. Would an expert have helped me to put the right names to things? To maybe clarify some thinking? Possibly. Would it have taken me any further than that? I'm not sure.
Having identified racist stereotypes or tropes, why wasn't it appropriate to consider, in terms of looking at whether or not they were responding correctly to the risk, to take into consideration that they may be using, as in your words, the scary black man trope?
And I'm not saying it wasn't appropriate to take that into account. I'm saying to you, I was taking that into account. You're asking me if I needed an expert to help me take that into account. And I said, well, we can always, it's always good to expand your knowledge. It's always good to have more knowledge, to know more things. And yes, I can agree that that might have been of assistance. It didn't stop me making the assessments to the best of my ability at the time.
I see, yes. But we do understand in that regard that there's at least one possibility of an area in relation to racial matters, i.e. The slap to the face and the checking to see whether or not Mr. Bai was conscious or not, that wasn't something that was on your antenna, as it were, in terms of race.
It was something I noticed that might not have been appropriate. Did I put a race label onto it at the time? I've been completely open with you that no, I don't think I did.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. The question I'd like to ask you about is expanding out the issue of investigation of crime. There was also a duty on the Crown to make sure it complied with duties under Article 2 and Article 14. Now, Article 2, read with Article 14, prohibits discrimination, and what we understand, and will no doubt come understand much more clearly when we go into this next module, is that the authorities are under a duty to take all reasonable steps to unmask any racist or discriminatory motive and establish whether prejudice played a role in the death. So it's not only the issue of whether or not there was criminality, but the Crown was under a duty to assess whether or not there was discriminatory motive or whether or not prejudice played a role. Now, what evidence was given to the inquiry, I think on the first day, was you said we were going that extra mile to unmask any motives, and I think that was in relation to the evidence you gave that day. Now, what question I want to ask you about this was, nowhere in any of the documents that we've seen do we see an analysis done by the Crown of whether or not there was any discriminatory motive or whether or not prejudice played a role in his death. So I suppose the first thing is, ought a piece of work to have been done in that regard, having regard to the test, to look out for these things, even if it's a note with a list of here are the things that we've identified, here is our decision in respect of that. Ought that to have been done as a separate piece of work?
When you're talking about the Article 14 obligations, you're talking about the whole investigation into the death.
Indeed.
And that includes this process.
Indeed.
And so the process that we were engaged in at that time was looking specifically, and it's been described to you as this linear process of the criminal investigation. And as I said yesterday and the day before, it was important to investigate the aspect of race insofar as it fed into that specific part of the investigation, which was the criminal investigation. And that was what we were looking at that stage. Now, that's not to minimise the aspect of race in the criminal investigation with regard to mens rea and evil intent. That's particularly what I was focused on. The wider aspect of the investigation into race was, as I understood, to come later, either within the Crown's own investigation for fatal accident inquiry or as part of a public inquiry.
Well, obviously at the time when you were doing this work and looking at it originally, we were far away from any question of a public inquiry. There had been no decision taken in that regard. Are you saying that when you were dealing with it, there was no formal process therefore done assessing to that stage whether or not the Crown had complied with its duties in terms of Article 2 and Article 14, aside from the criminal prosecution?
In death investigations, whether they are criminal or there is no criminal aspect of it, and it's specifically dealt with the Scottish Fatalities Investigation Unit, the Article 2 obligations on the Crown are considered at each and every stage.
Well, I suppose I come back to my first question. If those duties are considered at each and every stage and aren't hived off to future proceedings like an FEI or like something else, ought that work to have been done at that stage, at each and every stage, and a note, a discussion, a document to say, can we look at whether or not there was any discriminatory motive? Can we look at whether or not prejudice played a role in his death to ensure ourselves that we are properly obtempering our duties at that point?
I think the Crown in their investigation were constantly thinking, are we properly tempering our duties? Are we complying with Article 2 and Article 14? But the stage that we were at was particularly focused on potential criminality.
Indeed, but with regards to your earlier question saying we considered at every stage, I go back again to my question, would it have been a good idea to have that there doesn't appear to be anywhere in writing. Everyone's come in and said it was part of our obligations, we were considering it, but I don't see anybody addressing it in anything that was done. So if you were considering it at that stage, would it have been a good idea to simply have some, let's address this test, let's see that we're obtempering our duties?
I think that was perhaps just a given. It wasn't something that we thought required to be put down in writing. In retrospect, to enable me to answer your question, it might have been a good thing to have in writing. The evidence of the fact that we were thinking about it and considering it is perhaps, first of all, in the initial letter to the PERC, which of course it's outlined. The investigations that followed on from that, which was looking in detail into the disciplinary records of the police officers, particularly looking at any racial bias. So that was a focus of the investigation. We looked at potential other criminality that officers may or may not have been involved in. We considered potential information from the wider families of officers, and those again were targeted towards looking at racial motive. So the evidence, rather than it being written down in a particular document, is perhaps there in all the avenues that the Crown pursued right from an early point.
Would the best avenue to have pursued to be assess the language of what the police officers actually said had happened and get a race expert in?
That might have been an option. with hindsight, that might have been a good option. I think perhaps it may well have been difficult to identify the correct expert, but nevertheless, it's an option that we could have taken.
I think we'll come to hear about lots more experts on race
I'm sure
in
you
hearing,
will.
hearing to come. Finally, as part of that, the Crown are under a duty to accountability, transparency. We know these are all watchwords of these things. How can we be satisfied, for example, had there not been a public inquiry, how can we be satisfied that Article 2 or 14 has been complied with, that those tests have been carried out and complied with without us having something in writing to address that?
Well, my understanding was that there was to be at least a fatal accident inquiry. So that would be part of the public aspect of the full death investigation. There is, of course, the recognition and all the details that this public inquiry now have from the Crown, and perhaps it is in those documents that we can see all the different aspects of the Article 2 obligations.
I see what you say about the overall duty of a state to obtemper those obligations, and the state at the end of the day with its bodies has to be accountable. But in a fatal accident inquiry, the Crown's job of its assessment's already done.
In what way do you mean?
Well, the question when we're looking at Article 2 and Article 14 is about how has the state complied? Have the organs of the state worked in making sure that compliance? I'm not quite sure the analysis of the Crown waiting until a public inquiry to test their obligation under Article 2 and Article 14 holds up to analysis. I just would perhaps like your comment on that.
I think what we are looking at here, and the inquiry has heard that the Crown doesn't follow this incremental stage currently, is that we're looking at the stage where the criminal investigation comes to an end. A decision has been made with regard to criminality. If the case had moved on to a fatal accident inquiry, the end of the criminal investigation would not have been the end of the Crown's investigation. There would have been much more preparation done for the fatal accident inquiry, and that is the problem that we've seen with regard to the incremental approach, because it builds in too much time between the death and the fatal accident inquiry. And so that's been recognised, and that further work and those further jobs, and there is a lot of work to get a case ready for a fatal accident inquiry and for the Crown to present the evidence as a whole, and much wider evidence than you would find simply in a criminal recognition. And so the focus in a preparation for a case for fatal accident inquiry is different than the focus in a criminal investigation. So that's perhaps a long answer to say I would expect, if it was going to a fatal accident inquiry, that the Crown would do more work in preparation for presenting the public aspect of that inquiry.
If I just may ask a follow-on point for that, I appreciate that I'm at the end of my questions, but I'd just like to ask a specific point on the work done by the Crown.
Very well.
My learned friend touched on it before. If there was going to be a fatal accident inquiry, the Crown would continue its work in relation to race and in relation to whether or not it obtempered its duties under Article 2 and Article 14. The same presumably then for a public inquiry.
I don't have experience in preparing for the Crown in a public inquiry.
Well, one of the two options would be the public venting of whether or not the state's organs had complied with Article 2 and Article 14. We don't actually see anywhere that the Crown did something in relation to race post the decision about a conviction.
And I understand that to be to do with the authority of the public inquiry and their role, as opposed to the Crown's role in a fatal accident inquiry. But I am straying into something that I don't have a huge amount of experience with because I have not experienced a public inquiry before.
Well, perhaps we won't pursue that if that's not going to be of assistance to the court. I'm obliged.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms Edwards, thank you very much for coming to give evidence to the inquiry. I'm very grateful for your time. I'm going to adjourn briefly in order that the inquiry may be set up for the next stage of this hearing, and you'll then be free to go.
Thank
The
you.
inquiry will adjourn briefly. Good morning. Welcome to the Sheku Bio inquiry. The terms of reference of the inquiry require me to establish the extent, if any, to which the events leading up to and following Mr. Bio's death, in particular the actions of the officers involved, were affected by his actual or perceived race, and to make recommendations to address any findings in that regard. The issue of race has run like a thread through each of the hearings of the inquiry, and at every stage the inquiry has explored whether events were affected by Mr. Bio's race. And you've just heard an examination along these lines. The inquiry will now begin a hearing focused specifically on race. Over the next few weeks, the inquiry will receive evidence from a number of witnesses who will address aspects of race. These will include academic witnesses, police officers, representatives of the Crown Office and PERC, as well as witnesses with practical and lived experience of deaths in custody where race was an issue. And the inquiry will also receive evidence of relevant previous cases and reports. This will allow the inquiry to examine the earlier evidence in the light of the evidence to be heard in this hearing. And we're going to begin with the evidence of Professor Nasar Meer. So could we have Professor Meer in, please? Please sit down. Good morning, Professor Meer.
Good morning.
Would you say the words of the affirmation after me, please? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you very much. Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
You are Nasar Meer.
I am.
What age are you?
I'm 44.
And you are a Professor of Social and Political Sciences currently at the University of Glasgow.
That's correct.
And prior to that, you were at the University of Edinburgh,
Yes.
also in that role.
Yes.
And I am interested in how long you have held the role of Professor.
I was appointed to professor at the University of Strathclyde in 2016. And I was a reader before then at Strathclyde, which is a step before a professor. And I was a reader at Northumbria University for a number of years, which is a step before professor.
Right. And how long have you been working in this field?
I did my PhD in this area in 2007, and prior to that I was working as a researcher with colleagues in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, and prior to that I undertook a master's degree in this area, and between the master's degree and the PhD I worked on this area as well in Glasgow.
Now, the inquiry approached you and asked you to prepare a report specifically for this hearing. And I wonder if you could look at the document for me. If we look at SBPI 00597. Now, just to explain to you that when I ask you about a document, such as your report, it will appear on the screen.
And you'll see that in front of you. And if you're comfortable, we can talk about it from the screen.
Okay.
And at the same time, everyone in the room will be able to see that on the screens in the room.
Yes.
But in addition, there's a blue folder in front of you, and that contains a hard copy. It contains hard copies of things that you may find useful during the course of your evidence. And if you prefer a hard copy, please feel free to use that in any way that you find useful.
Thank you.
And as we go through your evidence today, if there are other documents or matters you would like us to have on the screen, please let me know and we'll make arrangements. And if we don't have it instantly, then we will arrange it over the next break if we can. So if you feel you need anything, please do share that with me and we'll make arrangements.
Thank you.
So you recognise, of course, the expert report that you've prepared for the hearing, which we can now see the start on the screen.
I do.
And we'll go through just the introductory parts of this. You'll see that you've prepared a contents page. It's page 2 of the PDF. And that goes through, we'll see at the top of the contents, you give us a section about yourself and your own history, which I'll turn to in a moment. The instructions you were sent by the inquiry team, a list of data sets and reports that you've consulted, and then key terms, and then you go through the detailed content of your report. And we'll look at some elements of this today.
Okay.
And if we could turn to the section that is about the author. Now, before I go through some of the detail of this professor, with other witnesses, we have a statement, and I ask them to speak to the statement and confirm it's their statement. But this that we see a segment of, and the hard copy you have, that is the full report that you've prepared for the inquiry.
It is.
And it's 43 pages long.
Yeah.
And can I confirm with you that in terms of what you were asked to do by the inquiry, you've done your best to be absolutely truthful and accurate in everything that you've said?
I have, yes.
And if during the course of the evidence you think there's some error or some issue, would you please draw that to our attention?
I will.
Thank you. And so for the purposes of this hearing and for the chair, are you happy that the chair considers the full extent of your report with the footnotes, and that is effectively your evidence to this inquiry?
Yes.
Thank you. Can we look at this page of your report, which talks about you and explains your role as professor at Glasgow University, and it also gives a summary of some of the previous roles that you've held. And I see you were in Strathclyde, you've been in Edinburgh. You also say you held a visiting professorship at the University of Copenhagen in 2020. And you also held a fellowship for Harvard University 2012 to 2013. And can you explain to the chair a little about how it was that you got these fellowships, and how significant are these types of things in your field? And please don't be modest.
They're a sign of professional accolade. They're competitive. So the Minda de Gunsberg Fellowship at the University of Harvard in the Centre for European Studies is through competition, and a handful of people are selected every year to be at the University of Harvard and to undertake your own research. I don't know how many people applied for that in the year that I attended, but there were no more than 8 of us who were recruited. A visiting professorship is typically through invitation by an institution which thinks that its reputation and its work will be enhanced by collaborating with you. And so they may offer you a short period of time to come and visit, use their resources, engage with their students, and they will either remunerate that or they will help contribute to your allowance whilst you're there in terms of accommodation and so on.
And it would appear that these are international appointments, international fellowships. So can I can I presume from that that they're not restricted to applicants or consideration only in the field, only in Scotland or only in the UK?
That's correct. They're global.
They're global. Thank you. So when you say that they are competitive, that will be on a global scale.
Yes.
And I also see that you have a number of degrees, including a PhD in sociology, which you got in 2007.
Mhm.
And then towards the end of the bottom of the screen as we see it, I see that you've also served as Commissioner on the Royal Society of Edinburgh Post-COVID-19 Futures Inquiry 20 to 21. Tell us a little about that.
That was a specially convened inquiry by the Royal Society of Edinburgh, which is Scotland's national academy, which brought together practitioners, service users, researchers and policymakers to put forward an agenda for what a post-COVID Scotland should prioritise in terms of recovery. And we published that after a series of consultations, and then shared it with policymakers at party political conferences.
And in relation to the pandemic and COVID-19, was there a specific issue that related to your area of expertise that they were interested in your assistance with?
Equalities and inequalities.
And can you explain a little more about that?
Yes, in terms of the impact of the pandemic on Scottish life wasn't equally felt. So historical inequalities were exacerbated. For example, labour market participation, or educational outcomes, or experiences in public life more broadly, where there were existing inequalities of the pandemic, the closure, and then the economic impact of those would exacerbate those historic inequalities. And so going forward, imagining what a post-COVID society would look like requires attention both to the historic inequalities, but also how they would manifest in the present.
So inequalities appeared in relation to ethnic minorities, not just as a result of the illness of COVID-19, but also in the wider
Absolutely.
social field.
So there was obviously the disproportionate impact of COVID in terms of mortality rates and infection rates, so the event, but the historic inequalities which characterize society going into that pandemic were then replicated coming out of it. And the question for the Commission and more broadly is how can we attend to that without just reproducing the historic inequalities?
And is that something you were able to contribute to because of your experience and your role in this field?
Yes, and it went hand in hand with participating with the Scottish Government on its COVID-19 ethnicity reference group, which was partly present-centred. It was focused on the impact of the pandemic at the time, but it was also focused on, well, what do we do next in terms of recovery? What are the areas of priority for coming out of the pandemic? And how do we ensure that the ethnic and racial inequalities that we carried into the pandemic aren't merely replicated coming out of it?
Thank you. And you say here you're also a member of the Anti-Racism Interim Governance
Yes.
Group, established by Ministerial Appointment 2022. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yes, that was one of the recommendations which came from the Ethnicity Reference Group. One of the challenges we found in Scotland in recent years has been that there seems to be something of an institutional memory loss when it comes to tackling ethnic and racial inequalities. Partly that's a reflection of the nature of civil service change. People in particular roles who develop a skill set will move over time and with them take that stock of knowledge. Partly it's a reflection of a loss of policy focus, or being crowded out by other seemingly more pressing issues. Partly it's a reflection of not retaining up-to-date information, evidence, data. So one of the recommendations which came out of the Ethnicity Reference Group was that should there be another event like this, we need to draw upon the best practice, best experiences that we've generated in attending to the dynamics that we've seen during this pandemic, but also more broadly establish a way of ensuring we have that institutional memory that draws together those multiple strands of government, of policy, of research, but also of practitioner experiences, people in community life doing their work. And the interim anti-racism interim governance group was a group which was dedicated to scoping out how we build something like a national observatory to achieve that. And we completed our work and made our recommendations.
And are those recommendations publicly available?
Yes.
And they recommend, am I correct in saying, how to avoid this institutional memory loss?
Partly, amongst other things, also to ensure that there's voice and participation from stakeholders who might not always be consulted, that policy is co-produced with their involvement, and that the agenda setting for what the priorities should be isn't something they hear about secondhand, something that they can contribute to in the making of. I do refer to it in the reports.
And that's something that would be available to the chair, should he
Absolutely.
wish to consider those recommendations.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And you've also mentioned that you currently chair the academic committee of the Stuart Hall Foundation. I wonder if you could explain what that role is.
Yes, Stuart Hall, the late Stuart Hall, was a sociologist, a cultural studies scholar. He held many academic posts, but he was also an academic committed to public education. He played a really important role at the Open University for a number of years. And when he passed, a number of his friends and students thought that we should find a way and means of ensuring that legacy is carried on. There was so much goodwill, there were so many students, there were so many beneficiaries of his work that they established a foundation which has two wings. One wing is a public-facing wing, which brings together practitioners, artists, policymakers, and researchers. But there's also a wing which is concerned with supporting scholars and fellows who are in their doctoral training stage or their postdoctoral training stage. And those are normally effectively funded fellowships which rest with the universities in the UK and around the world. We've had over 100 who have passed through that now, and we're actually about to start recruiting the next round. So at any one time we'll have perhaps 30 or so live fellows with us in their doctoral studies, but overall we have more than 100.
Thank you. And then you said you have been elected as a fellow of the UK Academy of Social Sciences and a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And for those that are listening, can you explain what it means to be a fellow?
It's a recognition of excellence in your career and your stage.
Thank you. And is that's not something you can just apply for and pay an annual fee, is it?
No.
No, it's not. All right. Can I ask you now to look at, just very briefly, the next page, which is the instructions. And you've replicated here the instructions that were sent to you from the inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
And you've expressed that this expert report is comprised of 3 parts, providing information and analysis relevant to the inquiry's approach to the issue of race, and it responds to the following inquiry instructions. And in essence, have you taken the instructions from the inquiry and responded to those specific instructions?
Yes, as best I can.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And you've split that into 3. We can see 1 and 2 here on the page, but if we can start with 1, you were asked for a definition with brief discussion of the following concepts and any others you think may be relevant to inform the inquiry's approach to the issue of race. And there's a list there, and we'll go through a number of these, but a list of topics and words and phrases that the inquiry asked you to provide definitions for.
That's correct. Yeah.
To make sure we were all on the same the same understanding. And then number 2, an overview of the background context to issues of race and race discrimination in Scotland. And then a number of topics and aspects were specifically set out in the instructions that the inquiry had particular interest in you, hearing from you on.
Yes.
And we can see those there. And then 3, an overview of race and policing in Scotland, including the following topics or aspects. And that included statistical evidence, observations, survey evidence.
Yes.
So essentially 3 aspects the inquiry had particular interest in, and you've responded to all of those.
Yes,
And that's essentially the body of this report.
it is.
And then can we turn on to the next page, list of data sets consulted. Now, you've listed a number of these, and you've given them bullet points over 3 pages. But for the members of the public who are listening, can you explain what a data set is?
Yes, a data set is the accumulated repository of information generated through inquiry. So we might have a government data set, which is generic, like the census, but we might have a government data set which is thematic. So we might focus on criminal justice system, and that's accessible. Anybody can look at it and use it for their purposes with the appropriate citation of where they got it from. But a data set can also be an academic body of knowledge, which is either the full study that's been undertaken as part of a project, or the specific parts of the study, which is just the primary data rather than the interpretation of that data. And it can also be information which is compiled by neither governmental nor academic agents. It might be something like a set of polling data, which I've also included and referred to. So YouGov polling or Ipsos polling and so on.
And these 3 pages cover a list of the various data sets that you've considered and had regard to as part of your work for the inquiry.
Yes.
And also, no doubt, your work more generally.
Yes.
And is it from this data that you apply analysis and draw conclusions?
Yes, in addition to the reports and the academic literature, which helps to frame the interpretation of the data.
And in fact, if we turn to Roman numeral F8, list of reports consulted,
Yes.
have you also given us a detailed list covering, again, a full 3 pages of the reports that you've also had regard to for the work of the inquiry?
Yes, that's correct.
And so you have considered all of this information, and are your conclusions based upon this information, both the data sets and the reports and other information that you have available?
That's cited in the report, yes.
Yes. Thank you. And just looking at the list of reports, do we see on page 8 that this includes, for example, the second last bullet point, Scottish Government progress review into anti-racism in Scotland from 2023, last year. And above that, you've also looked at things such as Scottish Government reports from last year on ethnicity in the justice system. So that's a thematic position. Analysis of labour market outcomes in Scotland's minority ethnic population. And you've also looked at CRER's Scotland's National Performance Framework from the Coalition in 2020, and they're one of the core participants in this inquiry. And then on the next page, do we also see that you've also looked at a report from Inquest last year called I Can't Breathe, Race, Death and British Policing. And we hope to hear from one of the directors of Inquest in this hearing in due course. And you've also looked at the then Dame Eilish Angelini's report in 2017, now Lady Angelini, into the independent review of deaths and serious incidents in police custody.
Yes.
And on page 10, we see that you not only looked at her 2017 report, but you also looked at her report on the independent review of complaints handling in 2020,
Yes.
which again was Lady Angelini.
Mhm.
And you've looked at the report of the inquiry into the liaison arrangements between the police, the Procurator Fiscal Service and the Crown Office and the family of the deceased, Mr. Chokar,
Yes.
by Raj Jandu.
Mhm.
And that was in 2000.
Yes.
And towards the bottom of that page, do we also see that you've looked at the Macpherson report regarding the Stephen Lawrence inquiry
Mhm.
in 1999?
Yes.
So the reports and the data is not just from the recent past few years, it's actually going back quite some way in relation to the reports that you've considered.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Can I ask you, taking away from the body of your report first of all, it may be said that you've never been a policeman.
Yes.
You do not have any experience or expertise in operational policing. And I think that's clear from your,
Yes.
your CV. Do you consider that your lack of experience as a policeman or in relation to operational policing, that has prohibited you or inhibited you in any way in the preparation of your report and in your ability to assist the inquiry?
No, not for the purposes of this report. I have nowhere claimed in it that I have those qualities or experiences, and I don't believe I require them to undertake this research.
Can I say, if at any stage during the course of your evidence today, you consider that you cannot answer any of my questions because perhaps you don't have experience of policing, I'm not anticipating that, but if that does happen, would you please let us know immediately?
Yes, of course.
Thank you. And can I ask you about a comment you made in 2017? Now, I'm going to read this out. I think there may be a hard copy in the blue folder for you.
Okay.
I'm just going to read out, this is a quote which has been made public by the, so it should be in the blue folder. And to give you some context, it was in relation to a talk or a discussion. Do you have that?
I do, yes, thank you.
And please follow it. The chair will also have a copy with the assessors. And it was at the University of Southampton, and you were delivering a talk, I think, there on the 31st of March 2017. I'm going to read out the passage and then I'll ask you some questions about it. So this is in quotation marks. So some of the survey work I have been doing over the last few years has been the first of its kind in trying to focus exclusively on the experiences of black and ethnic minority people in Scotland. And this does show us some quite interesting findings. The first is that when asked, about 1/3 of black and ethnic minority people in Scotland will say that they have experienced racial discrimination in the last 5 years. But 60% of the same sample that they didn't report it. So if it was in work, they didn't report it to an employer. If it was in education, they didn't report it to the tutor. If it was on the street and it was physical, they didn't report it to the police. This discrimination isn't something which is located in one particular area. It is actually quite dispersed across the social field, across the labour market participation, across access to public services, and in education and in health. And these kinds of findings occur at a time in Scotland when there is a salience of race. I mean, the case of Sheku is illustrative because it has all the characteristics of what we would call institutional racism. This young man, about my size and build, was suffocated at a bus stop in Kirkcaldy, and his family are now, searching for justice in many of the same ways as the Lawrence family did. So race does matter in Scotland, so it is misleading to suggest that everything is okay on that issue. And that ends the quotation. And I'd like to ask you, first of all, looking at, or you are able to look at what I've just read out, did you make those remarks in Southampton?
I made some of those remarks. The Southampton event wasn't recorded, and a transcriber put together notes based upon the panel discussion. So the data ones are consistent with mine, and because I sent them the slides. But the other part of the discussion isn't precisely what I said, and I know that because I've gone back to my records, and I found both the digitally date-stamped script I used to speak, the digitally date-stamped slides I presented, and the dated email and digitally date-stamped response to the transcriber who wrote up comments. And I explained very clearly that these are not my words and this is not a statement from me. And I've shared those with you.
And in relation to the comments that are made specifically in regard to Shekubayo and institutional racism and being suffocated at a bus stop, are those to what you're referring? Did you say those words?
No, they're not my words.
They're not
They're
your
not
words.
my words.
Did you say something similar that is akin to
Yes.
what I've read out to you?
I was trying to establish that race was salient in Scotland, so I used
Sorry, race was what?
race was salient in
Salient.
Scotland. And so I used a slide which was a Guardian story with an image of Mr. Bayou alongside a BBC news item on a different topic. And the transcriber has taken, I presume, taken sight of the information in the cover story and filled in the gaps and established a narrative which I have then corrected in 2017. And that clearly hasn't been updated in terms of what was posted online, which is relatively recent because I spoke at the University of Winchester. I think that centre has been absorbed into the University of Southampton, and they have now started to curate an archive, but they haven't put the right version of my comments up.
So you'd corrected it at the time.
I did, yes.
But since Winchester has been absorbed into Southampton, that it would appear that an older version has
It's
been
possible. It's
found
possible.
its way on.
And I can quite easily ask them to put the correct version up and take it down, but having seen it and you'd drawn it to my attention, I didn't want to do that without explaining myself, as it were.
So, again, is there anything about your own view? Have you formed your own views in any way about the incident relating to Mr. Bayou, which would inhibit or colour your evidence to the inquiry today?
I think that it's very difficult not to, in all seriousness, think about a topic deeply and have views based upon evidence. But I think that's different from having views that are prejudiced to understanding the evidence.
Right.
And I
Thank
don't
you.
think I'm of the latter view.
Thank you. Now, the final matter I'd like to explore with you relates to, as I understand it, you are a co-editor of a journal known as Identities Journal.
Yes.
And a quote has been attributed to you within that journal, and I'd like to read that out and ask you for your comments on that. So it says, Meer illustrates how discussions about racism within Police Scotland are a sensitive matter when a senior police officer spoke at length about the presence of institutional racism within the Scottish police force. He refused permission to allow a record of it to be included in the conference report 2019. And there's a citation there.
Yeah.
And one interpretation is that you've had some involvement in that. You're obviously co-editor. I just wondered what your comments were in relation to that quotation.
So there's two parts to that query, which I'm trying to understand as to the nature of the issue, because the first part is a direct quotation, which slightly inaccurately refers to me. I don't say that, and so due diligence, I don't have the notes in front of me, but if you put the two together and you read the article which is quoted, you will see that I'm describing an interview undertaken with a stakeholder in Scotland who said that they've held a stakeholder session with Police Scotland, and a senior police officer talked about institutional racism. And they, excuse me, and they weren't able to put that into the formal report. So that's my description of the interview of what a stakeholder told me, and that's in the article. The quotation of that presents me as the author of that statement, and which is obviously not the case. But that would be apparent if you put the two things together. So I'm presuming that's not the complaint. I'm presuming the complaint is potentially that as a co-editor of the journal, I'm in some way responsible for promoting a view. And that's, I mean, it's a peer-reviewed journal. We're not quite Nature, but we're about to hit 30 years. You know, we have 500 peer-reviewed submissions a year. I'm one of 2 co-editors, 7 associate editors, 30 editorial board members. It's not in my power to publish papers that refer to me. And there's, you know, nearly 6,400 references to me on Google. So, you know, it'd be surprising if there weren't some in that journal.
And again, do you consider that there's anything in relation to this aspect I've asked you about that would cause you to be biased in any way or impact on your independence in relation to the evidence that you're going to be giving the chair?
No, because it hasn't altered anything that I've said and done.
Thank you. Can I ask you to move on to the key terms section of your report, which is page 11. It's the next page here. There we are. And I'd like to go through some of these key terms with you. Obviously, all of them will be available for the chair to consider. Now, I see you've put them in alphabetical order, which is very helpful. Before we begin with your list, I wonder if I can ask you for your thoughts on the word black, which obviously would be the first word if it was in alphabetical order.
So I wrote a book on key terms in race and ethnicity, in which there was a chapter on black, and I sent it to you subsequently following the query. So it's very hard to distill in a sentence, and it may reflect, that may be the reason I haven't popped it into the key terms here. But I would say, and in the fuller chapter, if I was to distill it, I would say that black can be an identity category that people self-define with, and they self-define as being potentially of people of black African descent. But black can also be a political identity. It can be a vehicle for self-empowerment in the context of historic racism. But black is also something which is relational to white and to other identity categories. For a long time it was a pejorative in the US. African Americans reclaimed it. They turned a negative into a positive through both political mobilization, through the civil rights movement and black power, but also through, you know, an aesthetic movement. Think about James Brown, you know, I'm black and I'm proud. Were I to use it in this report, I would likely use it in the way of how people of black African descent self-define, and also how people who are mobilizing against anti-racism identify as politically black.
In the body of your report, you talk about the paradox of race, and I think you acknowledge that race is a social construct. Can you explain that concept for us?
Yeah. So one way to think of race, and I think the most helpful way to think of it, is as a verb rather than as a noun. Race is a doing word. We create races through various criteria. And that criteria of difference might be skin colour. Excuse me.
We have some water available. It might help. It can be very warm in this room. It can be quite dry with air conditioning. So please feel free to.
So race is a verb, not a noun. It's a doing word. It creates a hierarchy of difference, and that difference can be based upon skin color or phenotype. It can be based upon language. It can be based upon religion, and all of those things have been criteria of relevance for race in the past. One of the key things to understand about race is that we can simultaneously use it, as we do, as a legal and as an administrative category to monitor and redress histories of racialization. So the paradox is that we need to recognize race in order to address its injustices. And so throughout the report, I identify a number of ways in which race has been operationalized in legislation, in policy, in approaches which may be formal or informal, as well as in activist mobilizations for redressing racialization. And so in addition to text box 1, where I try and summarize this, in paragraphs 1.2 and 1.21, I elaborate on that a little further and throughout. Because race is, dynamic, part of the challenge is to ensure that you retain a focus on the work that race does for the people who mobilize it, but also the historic injustice that mobilization is either trying to address or continues. So when we talk about race as being a paradox, that's what I mean.
Thank you. Going back to the key terms, you see the first there is colour blindness.
Mhm.
Tell us what you mean when you talk about colour blindness.
Yeah. I mean, again, I talk about this at great length in the reports, but I suppose the important thing to understand about colour blindness is that rather than it being a means of avoiding racism, in many respects, it's a continuation of it by ignoring the fact that racially discriminatory outcomes will continue if you ignore their impact. So people might say, oh, I'm colourblind, I don't see race. Well, congratulations, but society carries on, and society sees race, and the impact of that race will not be diminished by ignoring what you choose not to see.
We've heard some evidence of people saying, I treat everyone the same and I don't see race.
Yeah.
I'm summarising,
Yeah.
obviously, a lot of evidence. And others have given evidence to the chair to say, we try and see that race and see the differences, acknowledge those differences and try and treat people according to their
Yeah.
own needs. Is that a distinction you recognise?
Absolutely, and in the opening sections I distinguish between two types of equality. So equality is uniformity, which says, well, if we just treat everybody the same, then we've satisfied the condition of equality, and we're not discriminating. But in a society where there are historical differences which have contemporary effects, to do so is really just to reproduce those inequalities. And so we might take our cue from the American jurist Ronald Dworkin and try to treat people equally, which requires taking historical context and contemporary inequalities into account. So he would argue in favour, and he did argue in favour of affirmative action on the basis that that was an equality movement. And that would be the same when it comes to colour blindness. To ignore what you think is race if you see it as colour, quote unquote. First of all, you ignore all the other ways in which race manifests and presents. But more importantly, you're ignoring the entire issue of the impact of racism.
Thank you. As I said, I won't ask you about all of the definitions, but can I move on to ethnicity?
Yeah.
Tell us about the distinction between race and ethnicity. Is there a distinction?
Yes, there is. I mean, the ways in which these are operationalized in public administration brings them together. And it's brought them together because there's a recognition that people aren't just modes of their oppression. So if people have historically been racialized in negative terms, inferiorized, that isn't the entirety of the person, that isn't the entirety of the group. People will self-define in ways which reflect more than that, reflect more than the perspective of the person who is being, or the institutions or the context in which they are racialized. You know, people have cultures, they have languages, they have collective memories, and they're all imagined and reimagined. They're not static, they're not stuck. they're dynamic. But what ethnicity allows us to do is understand that and explain how people self-define and how those categories of self-definition change over time. So, for example, we might find that, as we'll discuss later on, minorities are racialized as one kind. Whether or not they are part of that identity group, they might be racialized as Muslim, and Sikhs may be attacked for appearing Muslim. But Sikhs aren't the entirety of the perspective of their attacker's gaze. They are Sikh. They have their histories, they have their cultures, they have their customs, and ethnicity allows us to be attentive to that and not collapse group identities simply into the perspective of a mode of oppression.
So you've said that ethnicity is a looser definition than race. Would that be a wider definition than race, or could include wider categories?
Yes, and I've listed several here: language, collective memory, culture, ritual, dress, religion.
We may hear that to some extent, in some reports that we'll look at, that ethnicity and race have been, in a sense, interchangeable.
Yes.
Is that a common occurrence?
It is in public administration, and it is in things like the census, which I'm sure we'll come to. The challenge is not to treat either as monocausal, so simply to say, well, the difference between this minority's experience and that minority's experience is ethnicity, because there's something in their culture which is an impediment, or there's something in their religion which prevents them doing things, because that's to reduce them then to just being a category, rather than to see how ethnicity interacts with society and how it can be subject to all the shifts and dynamics as it is for everybody, including majorities who might have ethnicities too.
Thank you.
I mean, when we talk about Irish people in Scotland, we're appealing to an ethnic membership. Yeah.
Right, thank you. Can we look at indirect discrimination, which is just at the very bottom of the page? You said direct discrimination on the grounds of a protected characteristic is unlawful. For example, a job ad stipulating ethnic or racial minorities should not apply. And then you go on to explain indirect discrimination. Can you help us understand that?
Well, to pick up from the obvious example of direct discrimination, if the job has a uniform policy to work, and that uniform policy prohibits the wearing of a turban, then indirectly that prevents practicing Sikhs or Sikhs who wish to wear the turban from applying for that job. And to some extent that reflects real life cases that have been litigated in the past, where Sikhs have highlighted the ways in which formal equality legislation informally discriminates against them. And they are not the only minority.
So not an ad which says Sikhs should not apply.
Yeah.
But an ad where the requirements of the job simply preclude them from applying.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, thank you. Can we look at Islamophobia? Tell us about that, please.
Yeah. Again, I tried to elaborate at length in the report how a notion of Islamophobia should be read and understood in ways in which we talk about racism. Just as we accept that anti-Semitism describes a particular history of racism against people who are Jewish, and that hasn't stopped them being Jewish in different ways, over different contexts, in different times. There are specific tropes within anti-Semitism about power, hierarchy, hidden motives, and so on. Well, similar things are true of Islamophobia. Muslims of different ethnicities, different apparent racial characteristics, over different contexts, will be discriminated against on the grounds of prevailing tropes, which may see them as a security threat, may deem them to be a troubling or a problematic minority, may see them as being disloyal, and more broadly, as a problem within the population. And now that's not on the basis necessarily of their ethnicity or their racial characteristics. It takes into consideration, or it's mobilized on the grounds of their Muslimness, which is why I say that Islamophobia is akin to is a form of racism.
Thank you. A word that is not here but is used, and I wonder if you could help us define it, intersectionality.
Yeah.
What is that?
So, again, there are multiple ways in which one can think of intersectionality, but principally it talks about the ways in which different protected characteristics come together to produce a distinctive inequality. I think a pioneer of the concept was Kimberly Crenshaw, an African-American legal scholar who identified the ways in which black women in America were discriminated against on the grounds not of their gender solely, nor of their blackness solely, but of the ways in which those two protected characteristics came together. It was at that intersection that they were, in her case, in that example, prevented from applying or reapplying for their jobs at the Ford Motor Factory in Chicago. But we've used it in this country, and the Equality Act 2010 was the first act, as I understand it, which tried to draw together the intersecting possibilities of inequality from all of the other 9 protected characteristics. I think it's a concept which is yet to be properly mobilized in terms of understanding the ways in which different protected characteristics come together in Britain, but the groundwork is there.
So examples could be the, in terms of protected characteristics, gender and race.
Absolutely.
Could
Absolutely. Age and
combine.
sexuality.
Age and sexuality. Religion and race.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It could be a combination of 2 different protected
Yeah.
characteristics.
The intersection between them, yeah.
The intersection between them, thank you. Let's move on to the next page. Could you give me a moment, please? I'm conscious it's now 11:30.
We'll take a 20-minute break at this point. Ms. Graham.
Professor Meer, we were talking just before the break about the key words that
Yeah.
you'd identified in your report, and I wondered if we could have that back on the screen. I was just about to move on to page Roman numeral 12. There we are. And again, I'd just like to select a few words from this page to ask you about. In relation to racisms. Now, you have broken this down, and if we could have that maybe just slightly higher up on the screen, we'll see that there are 4 bullet points: interpersonal racism, structural racism, institutional racism, and systemic racism. Now, I know that you're going to come on to this
Yeah.
later, but I wonder if just briefly at this stage you could explain to people why you've broken it down in this way.
Yes. So the first thing to say is that racisms interact. They're not mutually distinctive. To the contrary, they're interdependent. They rely upon one another. But they can operate at different levels. But they can also operate through different forces, I suppose. So interpersonal racism is the one we're all the most familiar with. It might be covert, overt. It may be something that is expressed in language or behavior, words or deeds. Structural racism starts to get a bit more difficult to understand, but I suppose what structural racism is able to help us grasp is how racism reproduces. So when we talk in institutional racism about the role and function of stereotypes, well, it's structural racism which helps us to understand where the stereotypes have come from and why they reproduce. And in the presentation or in the slides we can elaborate that a little bit further. But there's a need to distinguish it from interpersonal racism. Institutional racism, in many respects, might be understood as the operation of types of structural racism within particular institutions, though given the similarity of a number of institutions, their shared dynamics, their statutory obligations, the publics that they serve, it's quite an expansive concept. It's one that's portable. So when we talk about the Metropolitan Police Service and the Macpherson Inquiry and institutional racism, we can find that also functions in the NHS and in different ways, but there's a commonality between it. And then systemic racism I describe in the report, and we'll come to again later, partly describes, well, it's the reach of it, so it's the way in which it shows that there's this depth to the racism within an institution or an organisation or something else. But it's also about the ways in which those link up across society. So if we want to understand something that's described as a school-to-prison pipeline, we need to connect the ways in which some young people from ethnic and racial minorities are treated in the education system in ways that make them more subject to surveillance and bring them into contact with the criminal justice system, and the particular interactions they have with the criminal justice system leads to often custodial sentences. So that chain can only be understood through a systemic approach by connecting the different institutions and different parts of society.
Right, thank you. I know we're going to come back to this in some detail, and I'll ask you for other examples then. Can I ask you, in relation to these definitions in these different categories, if it was suggested to you that your definition of systemic racism may appear more apt to describe structural racism, do you have any response to that?
No, and I think it will probably explain itself when we talk further on this topic, but there's a way in which we can use terms in a lay fashion, but there's a way in which these are categories of analysis. They're what's sometimes called ideal types, and then how they are adopted and used in different contexts will vary as categories of practice. And it may be that there's some tension there, but not for the purposes of this report and what I want to say in terms of speaking to it, no.
Thank you. And if it was suggested that really all the levels of racism that you identify here effectively make up systemic racism, and the other elements of racism are part of that, do you have any comment to make?
Well, they can, but they can also operate in ways which are more in narrower ways. So when we talk about systemic racism a little later, I mean, everything happens within a system. So, yeah, certainly the system is the whole. Okay, but that doesn't help you explain the interactions or the microaggressions or the particular dynamics of why one form of institutional racism functions in this way and why another form of institutional racism functions in that way. You need something a bit more sensitive to be able to analyse that. But they're not in contradiction, and we can elaborate with some more examples as we go.
Thank you. So for the purposes of the chair and his understanding of your report, if you refer to any of these particular types of racism, should he look at your definitions and the keywords?
Yes, I think so. I think
And
that's
take
satisfactory.
that.
Yeah.
Thank you. And you mentioned the word there, microaggressions. I'm interested in what they are.
So microaggressions comes from trying to grasp how people in particular settings, so they could be institutions, but they also could be outside of institutions, express racialized hostility without using racist terms. So they may be, I don't know, crowding people out of social gatherings, writing emails in a way in which doesn't recognize one of the recipient, talking in ways that in and of itself might not be described as racist or hostile, but is on a topic which is perhaps inflammatory or hurtful to some groups or to some people within that email chain. So, you know, it's a micro encounter. It's a thing which is a little harder to name and say, hey, this is so self-evidently obvious that you've done and said this. But in the context of particular cultures and particular histories and particular, you know, dynamics, it's very apparent to the people on the receiving end of them, anyhow.
So the addition of micro to aggressions should not diminish the significance and the harm that these can cause to the person who's on the receiving end.
No, they're part of what you might characterize as bullying.
Right, thank you. Continuing with your keywords here, racialization. Now you've mentioned that already, and you talk about people become racialized as members of racial groups. Could you expand on your understanding of that word?
So, if we think about people who self-define as whites in Scotland today, you'll find people who are in that category in 2024 who wouldn't have been in that category in 1924. Because they wouldn't have been racialized as part of a white majority. They would have been racialized as other. And so white Jewish people in Scotland, or white people with Irish ethnicities, or white people with Eastern European identities have been historically racialized out, and now I would argue racialized in. So in a way in which is part of the majority. What that suggests then is that the process of racialization shifts over time in relation to certain social and political dynamics. And what is true for majorities is also true for minorities. So when we talk today about Muslims, we are talking about a group that was relatively overlooked within the racial discrimination arena in the 1970s and 80s to becoming a minority which is now endowed with all the characteristics of a racialized group, and that's happened, you know, in my early adult lifetime over a period of 20 years, I would argue, in the UK.
Thank you. And The word here in the keywords section is racialization. The word racialized appears in the definition. Can you explain is there a distinction there
No,
that you wish
no,
to
there isn't.
draw?
Racial, again, I suppose we could say racialized is the verb. Racialization is the kind of the meta category, but they're describing the same thing. They're describing a process of turning a group into a quote unquote race through various criteria of relevance, which are deemed to be inferior or a problem.
So one's a verb, one's a noun, and you're describing the process.
Yes.
Thank you. Social disaggregation.
Yeah.
Now, disaggregation is a word within your report, and I wonder if you can explain to those listening what you mean by that, social disaggregation.
So again, it's for the purposes of data analysis. So we can have a large-scale survey of people's experiences of the NHS. And on the basis of that, say, okay, well, look, people have said that they raised concerns about the time it took them to see a clinician, but when they saw a clinician, their treatment was generally positive, and they were broadly positive about the aftercare. Okay, that's a generic survey. What that will hide is that there will be differential experiences within that data set for different groups. So it may be the case that some groups took longer to be seen, other groups, or the same group, had a more negative encounter with the clinician, and that they saw some other group didn't have the degree or the appropriate aftercare. And we can't know that from just treating the survey as a blanket. We need to disaggregate it and break it down according to the experiences of particular groups. And that's typically done with the categories that we use in social and public administration, so the census categories or equivalent.
So when you talk about disaggregation in your report, you have carried out that process of analysing the underlying data, if that's available.
Yes, if it's
into
available.
groups.
And I've said on a number of occasions, I've indicated where it is available and where it isn't. So, I mean, there are statistical standards that all UK public authorities and agencies should try to adhere to. There's variation between that, but often you'll find that there's a data set for the majority, and then there's the experiences of the non-majority put together, which is still useful because it tells us something, but it's not as nuanced or sensitive to being able to disaggregate further in terms of specific experiences for particular groups. Where that's available or possible to be done, I've done that.
And where that data is not available, what sort of problems does that cause for someone in your position trying to analyse differentials?
We can't.
Simply can't. Can we look at the next word? And this is a word that also appears in your report, and we've also heard reference to this, so stereotypes. Tell us a little about stereotypes.
Yeah, and again, it's a term that I think we'll come back to in more detail, but simply put, stereotypes are the ways in which we as individuals, but more broadly than that, as a society, can use cues or shorthand to describe groups on the basis of certain characteristics. Now that stereotype sometimes might be deemed positive. You know, we might say this group is renowned for being, you know, great at computational science. More often than not, they're negative, and we associate groups with blanket assumptions about their traits and dispositions or likely tendencies to present certain kinds of problems, be that criminality, be that violent threat, be that dishonesty or something else.
And can stereotypes be based on protected characteristics?
Yes, often, routinely. Race and ethnicity is an important one, but so is gender, so is able-bodiedness or disability. Stereotypes about age are routine and common. The interesting question is, in terms of race and ethnicity, where do stereotypes come from? How are they reproduced? How do they shift and change over time? When I was growing up in the 1980s, Asians, quote unquote, were deemed as being quite passive and meek. My kids grow up in the context where that their name may carry a threat in a public imagination because they're deemed to be potentially, Muslim or Islamic or something. So that stereotype shifts. But it still functions in the same way in giving a shorthand for a potential problem associated with a group.
And I'm interested, you've used the word shorthand, and I see in your definition here you use the phrase, they typically simplify and expedite perceptions and judgments. This idea of expediting and shorthand, can you just explain what that means?
Yeah. Well, that comes from some of the literature in the report, which talks about the ways in which stereotypes function as social cues, which shorten the processing time required to make decisions, simply. So that's the expedition. Because you're already walking around with a mental frame in which you're able to place people within particular categories, which give you a set of potential instructions on how to proceed.
Can you help the chair understand how quickly people can make judgments or decisions on the basis of a stereotype?
I think that's probably going a little bit beyond my expertise in terms of the report, but the secondary literature and what I've referred to suggests it's instantaneous. I mean, it's not even necessarily a conscious thing. We use these as mental cues to be able to govern our behaviour, and we may not be conscious that we're doing it.
And you use the word conscious or unconscious.
Yeah.
We've heard about the concept of unconscious
Yeah.
bias.
Yeah.
Have you some awareness and expertise in that area?
Yes, no, absolutely. I mean, unconscious bias is a feature of the landscape, and there's, and in the report, a number of studies which show that people will act on the basis of an assumption that they have that they're not necessarily aware of, but that assumption, is one which is populated with a distortion of what is the case. I mean, that's the bias. And you can tease that out in studies, and one of the studies that I'll speak to does that.
So would it be possible on that basis for someone to be asked, did you act on the basis of any bias? And for them to say no, and for that person to be genuinely believing that they had not acted in relation to any bias?
By definition, because
Yeah.
it's unconscious, unless they have taken a moment to reflect, educate themselves, learn, take soundings, and formed a different opinion in light of that. But unconscious bias proceeds precisely because we're not aware that we carry it.
Thank you. Can we move on to the final word here? And this is a word that also appears in your report. It's the concept of weighting.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I wonder if you could explain to those listening what that is all about.
So weighting is a statistical technique, and we use it to make sure that there's validity within a sample. So if I wanted to tell a story about Scotland and I surveyed the population, and in the demographic information it told me that, 70% of this sample is from Glasgow. If I reported the findings of that survey as is, I would effectively disproportionately report the experiences of people in Glasgow rather than people in Scotland. It wouldn't take in the breadth of the nation. So you have to apply statistical weights to that, which literally do what it sounds like. It drags down the Glasgow part, and it models or replicates the non-Glasgow part, so it gives you a more balanced sample. I mean, there's probability weights, frequency weights, analytic weights. They're statistical techniques which are done after the data has been collected to try and make it more representative, I suppose.
Thank you. And where that's been done, you will recognise that in your report?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. On matters that are not strictly within your this part of your report, but do relate to language. Can I ask you what comments would you have about the phrase anti-racism? Now, we've heard a number of people talk about anti-racism. Do you have any comments on that?
So simply put, anti-racism would be the advocacy of changes in society which promote racial equality. Now, like all concepts, it will have multiple strands to it. It'll have a minimal and a maximal kind of range. Much like race, we might think of it as an administrative category, through which we can monitor and therefore ideally redress historic and contemporary injustices which come from racism and racialization. We can think of anti-racist legal approaches that have proceeded through group-specific instruments and been introduced according to the social and political climate of the day. And the history of race relations legislation partly is an illustration of that. But more broadly than that, you can think about it as a social movement, like Black Lives Matter, which is a justice movement which makes a moral claim, moral argument for a world in which, well, as the title of the movement suggests, black lives have equal worth. Black lives matter. They're not just statistics or numbers. There's a quote from Martin Luther King in the report, I think it's in footnote 18, where I try and show the historical circularity of that argument. In some respects, that we're making similar arguments today that he was making in the 1960s, which speaks to his prescience, but also to the lack of progress in some respects, I think.
I think we'll come back to that issue. There's one other aspect before I move on. Can I ask you about paragraph 1.4.1? And this is in a section of your report on page 8 regarding Islamophobia in Scotland. So it's page, not Roman numeral 8, it's within the body of your report. And it's 1.4.1, there it is on the screen, Islamophobia in Scotland. And you talk here about a survey from 2015, which looked at the words and phrases respondents most associated with the term Muslim, which was terror, terrorist, terrorism. And that was the connection ahead of all other terms. And those other terms included both mosque and Quran. And you've commented on the sort of negative association there and with Muslim and explained that in your report. If it was said that to any extent this categorization and percentage was misleading, because I think you see in relation to that the majority of most words most associated with the term Muslim were terror, terrorist, terrorism, which would be considered negative connotations. But if it was said that more than 75% used non-negative words, would you have any views to express in relation to that?
Yes, it's mistaken. I have the poll in front of me and I went back and recounted to make sure that I wasn't imagining things. So...
and this is based on a poll which you've got in the footnotes.
Yes, it's a YouGov poll.
The YouGov poll.
So just on the empirical claim that it's more than 75%, it's not. So if you go back and you add up all the negative words or phrases, then you get 37%. So just the 75% claim is untrue, but that really misses the point of the poll. The poll isn't saying what are your most, give us your 40 most prominent words you associate with Islam. It's saying give us your 3 most prominent words. So what are the 3 most prominent words you associate? And that's what the poll is trying to gauge, the most prominent words, because it's a poll about salience, not about range and every possible statement that might be made about Muslims. So that's the purpose of the poll, and that's the context in which I've quoted it.
And that is the three most prominent words:
It certainly is.
terror, terrorist, and terrorism.
Yeah.
Thank you. Now, in the remainder of your report, if we move on back to figure A, which was just after the Roman numeral 12, we'll see a diagram where you've given Scotland's modern racial history, and we'll come on to that shortly.
Mm-hmm.
And that covers the period 1919 to 2023.
Mm-hmm.
So a period of over 100 years in Scotland. And then we have your report, the body of your report is split into 3 sections. And is that aligned to the instructions
It
that
is,
you
yes.
received? So part 1 is on page 2. If we move on to the next page, please. So part 1 of your report is entitled Equalities, Sameness and Difference.
Mhm.
And part 2 of your report is on page 17, and that is described as attitudinal experiences. That's page 17. Oh, sorry, you've gone past it. Sorry, I think we're at cross purposes here. It's 17 on the actual report and not on the PDF itself. Sometimes there's a difference between the PDF page numbers, which are shown on the screen, and there it is. Attitudinal experiences and outcomes, and that's part 2 of your report. And part 3 of your report is on the report itself. We'll see the numbers at the bottom right hand side, and it's page 31. There we are. And part 3 is composition, outcomes and perceptions of policing.
Mm-hmm.
And for the purposes of giving evidence today, the inquiry team asked you if you would be willing to prepare some PowerPoint slides to draw out some of the concepts that you've explained in considerable detail with footnotes in your report. Now, the report itself is available to the chair in full.
Okay.
But what I'd like to do today with you in evidence is to go through your PowerPoint, if I may. And you provided us with 23 slides, or 22 slides. And I wonder if we could have that on the screen, please. So this is WIT 00100. And we see there the opening first page, which has your name and your role as professor at the University of Glasgow and your qualifications, and a very nice picture of Glasgow. And if we could move on to page 2, please. And what I'd like to do is to go through these slides in turn.
Yeah. Okay.
And as we go through these, I'd like to ask you primarily just to talk through the slides and explain what we can see and how these would help the chair. And we'll go through maybe some sections of your report if that's required. So this is slide 2. It's entitled, on the left-hand side, Scotland's Modern Racial History, and it covers the period that we see on the right-hand side, 1919 to 2002. So it's a part of figure A that we just looked at in your report. And I wonder if you could tell us what we can see here in this timeline.
So the timeline adapts and updates one which was first produced in the Scottish Government's Race Equality Framework document published in 2016. And the purpose was really just to identify and spotlight some milestones. I've titled it Scotland's Modern Racial History because it begins with an episode of racially motivated violence against black sailors queuing to be hired in the yard of a mercantile marine office in James Watt Street in 1919. There's a historian, Jacqueline Jenkinson, and she describes this episode in a book called Black Sailors on Red Clydeside. And notably, she talks about the role of racist stereotypes and myths and hearsay about black sailors taking white jobs, and records that only black sailors were arrested and taken into custody. But the point in signalling that here is that Scotland has a very long and rich racial history, and one which is often, I think, forgotten when we talk about racism in the UK. It's typically discussed as an English problem. And Scotland's story within the British Empire, and Glasgow as a second city of empire, is often lost in that. So that's why I've begun it with there, and with that title. Do you want to just spotlight some key things, or do you want to identify some things?
I'll stop you when I want to identify particular things.
So we have what's typically the moment of the arrival of the Empire in terms of SS Windrush, which is seen as being something which happened in England. The people from that cohort, that generation, came to Scotland too, settled, made their lives. The policy process and the program of thinking about racism seriously doesn't really begin until the late 60s, mid-60s, late 60s, in terms of incremental legislation, UK-wide race relations legislation, which, as I set out in text box 3 of the report, starts to prohibit direct racism in public places, and then starts to extend those protections beyond public places, in areas of housing and in employment. And that's all relevant because really the accumulated legislation is decanted into the Scotland Act in 1998. The main instrument being the 1976 Race Relations Act, and as that's subsequently amended following the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. What I haven't got on here, and would be of relevance, is the Scarman inquiry conducted in 1981, which followed a number of periods of civil disorder and violence, really, in a number of English cities, in Toxteth, Liverpool, in St Paul's, in Bristol, Manchester and Moss Side, and so on. And it all culminated in London in 1981, in Stapleton Road, with an infamous case of where there was an illegal raid on a house that the Independent Police Complaints Board subsequently concluded, I quote, showed an institutional disregard for the law, on which the Metropolitan Police paid compensation. But Scarman was important and interesting because he put a great deal of stock and trade in a program of anti-racist training, anti-racist awareness within the Metropolitan Police. But it was criticised. It was criticised from the start because people felt that the reforms that he was pursuing were patchy. They weren't wholly introduced. Chief constables exercised a great deal of discretion in not taking them up. That trainers were inadequately prepared, insufficiently resourced. That programs lacked senior managerial authority, and rarely were they integrated into a wider policing program. And in retrospect, in 1987, Lord Scarman regretted this, and he talked about his disappointment at the lack of implementation, and went on to say, and I quote, he wished he would have been more outspoken about the necessity of affirmative action to overcome racial disadvantage. And that was him writing in 1987. So there's a prior history of thinking about race through public inquiries, in legislation, through case law, and then through narratives about collective membership up until the point of devolution. And it's really on devolution that Scotland, at the very foundation of its restoration or the introduction of the Parliament, accepted the recommendation of the Stephen Lawrence inquiry in 1999. This was a very significant undertaking at the point at which the Scottish Parliament is established. The Scottish Executive is underway. And this came with a number of implications, not least that it had statutory implications for what the legacy forces and then what became Police Scotland. And I quote that the full force of race relations, this is the recommendation, should apply to all police officers, namely that chief of police officers should be made vicariously liable for acts and omissions of their officers. The Lawrence Inquiry also, in its recommendations and in its acceptance by the Scottish Executive in 1999, offered a definition and an expectation that all public authorities would approach their engagement with ethnic and racial minorities in a way in which avoided or refused a colourblind approach. And it also foregrounded the importance of multi-agency working across different sectors. So it's striking because, you know, at the dawn of the Scottish Parliament, you have the Scottish Executive, which wholly accepts the recommendations of Stephen Lawrence Inquiry, which attend to many of the issues that repeat themselves subsequently.
So in the late 90s, by this time you've highlighted 2 pieces of statutory legislation in relation to race relations. The Scarman report had made a number of recommendations. Am I taking you talked about implementation? Was a recognition after the Scarman report that those recommendations hadn't been fully implemented at that
By
time?
Scarman himself, yes.
By Scarman himself. And then when we see the Human Rights Act 1998 and then the Scottish Parliament in 1999, that was at the sort of beginning or resurgence of the Scottish Parliament, reconvened.
Yeah.
And they endorsed the Macpherson definition. Is that the definition of institutional racism?
Yes, in addition to a number of other, not so much definitions, but recommendations, which had profound implications for how to govern and how to engage with ethnic and racial minorities and what the statutory obligations should be understood to mean.
And that was to ensure that all organisations avoid complacency
Yeah.
and guard against institutionalised racism. And that was said by the executive then, the Parliament, to ensure that that would be done.
Yes, that's correct.
And that was on the back of the Macpherson report, which was also from 1999.
Yes.
And I know you will come on to the matter, but as I understand it, and you say here, the Macpherson report was published in 1999
Yes.
with all the recommendations.
Yes.
And then looking forward from 1999, explain what we see at the end
Yeah.
of this timeline here that ends in 2002.
Well, not long after, we have 2 inquiries conducted into the murder of Surjit Singh Choker. 3 men were acquitted of his murder in 2 separate trials in 1999 and 2000. And in some respects, the case is seen as a test, really, of Scotland's criminal justice system on the grounds of equal treatment of ethnic and racial minorities. And it's a test that Scotland and its criminal justice system at the time is seen to have failed. The inquiries that were conducted detailed numerous errors in the police investigation, in the improper and traumatising treatment of the family, in the failures in the Crown prosecutions. So these failures included evidence of institutional racism, notably in the failure of the police to consider racial aggravation as a factor in their investigation of the crime, but also the unpreparedness of police and the procurator fiscal to respond readily to the cremation of Sikh funeral customs. There was also criticism of the failure of the procurator fiscal's office to recognise that a person such as Mr. Chokar could have, Surjit Singh's father could have had difficulty in understanding and following the case in English, and required translation services. There were other criticisms about the brief that the reviewing officer was given, it being vague and unfocused, and that the review itself into the investigation lacked rigour. But that issue of discounting and failing adequately to investigate the question of racial aggravation is one which repeats itself later.
And you've talked about that in relation to Chokar, and that was from 2001, I think you say on the timeline. A failure to investigate racial motivation.
Yeah.
And in relation to Chokar, I think you have provided some detailed information within the body of your report about Chokar that the chair can consider.
Yes.
And I think we see that on page 10 of your report. I don't need to go to that at the moment, but you have described that at paragraph 154 and beyond,
Yes.
ongoing. We will come back to that. So that was in 2001, and then in 2002, what do you say here about the actions of the Scottish Government at that time?
So the 2000...
2002.
Yeah, sorry, it's 2002. Oh, yes. So there's a period of what you might call policy sparsity and then policy density in terms of Scotland developing bespoke apparatus to speak to its own context and conditions rather than relying upon UK-wide approaches. Now, this is obviously partly logical, given that there wasn't that the Parliament, as you said, was reconvened in 1998. But it's also, I think, a reflection of thinking that race and racism is not a problem in Scotland, that there wasn't a sufficient critical literacy within the governance of Scotland, within its public administrations, up until this point. But you begin to see it burgeoning. So that's the first distinctive race equality scheme published, given that at this point Scotland therefore has a series of public policy areas for which it is primarily responsible under the devolution settlement.
And what is a race equality scheme?
We might call it a race equality action framework, a set of objectives that the what we now call the Scottish Government identifies as targets, and then goes back from that to think about how to implement them. How do we get there? What are the priority areas? What's the resource required? How do we find a path? What are the agencies that we need to bring on board? At this point, there wasn't a great deal of consultation, as in what are the communities we need to work with. Still very a top-down approach.
What do you mean by that?
I mean, it's a decision made centrally and presumably expected to be filtered downwards rather than co-produced in dialogue, feeding in from the experiences of the communities that they're serving or trying to serve.
And what are the limitations of filtering downwards as opposed to engaging the community?
Validity, a lack of understanding of whether or not what you think people need is what they need. And ideally you have both sides. You have policy being crafted, engineered, but then fashioned and revised in dialogue with its clients or users or communities who will be subject to it.
So views and recommendations being imposed on people as opposed to finding out what the people actually
I think so.
want and what would work for them.
Yeah.
And this part of the timeline covers over 80 years. And we see it's towards the end we have the Scottish Parliament endorsing Macpherson.
Mm-hmm.
Within a couple of years, the death of Mr. Chokar
Mm-hmm.
and the Raj Jandu report.
Mm-hmm.
And then the first race equality scheme published in 2002. Let's move on to the
Mm-hmm.
next slide. And this covers a period from 2007, and it says there 2023.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a much shorter period in time, and there are a number of entries. Could you, beginning at 2007,
Yeah.
could you talk us through that section?
Yeah. So this is when I think you start to see what we might characterise as policy density, partly a reflection of what's going on at the UK level in terms of harmonisation and the kind of patchwork approaches which are trying to bring together the different pieces of equality legislation historically and the different commissions which accompanied that equality legislation. But it's also a reflection, I think, of Scottish administrations becoming a little bit more confident, a little bit more literate, a little bit more engaged with the communities that they're seeking to serve. So the Equality and Human Rights Commission is formed, which brings together all of the other commissions which supported the then protected characteristics, because new ones are obviously added later in the Equality Act. There's some dispute over whether or not this would diminish or hierarchise certain characteristics. You know, would race be, to some extent, laundered out of a priority? That's still an open dispute. I think it probably has been the case that some equality characteristics and grounds have lost the focus and the momentum from a non-governmental body that they enjoyed under their commission prior to that. But nonetheless, it's an anticipation of the harmonisation of legislation in the Equality Act. Scotland and Scottish administrations are again trying to renew, refine their race equality schemes, their approaches to this within the broader configuration of devolution. And that really carries on to 2010, where the Equality Act brought together, you know, what was something of a mammoth collection of legislation, pieces of equality instruments, you know, that had been accumulated, and ideally levelled them upwards through a kind of a patchwork approach, which then established equality duties. And the Equality Act, to some extent, I don't know whether or not the Equality Act necessarily was engineered in a way in which expected Scotland to add its own duties, but there were three what you might call general duties which came with the Equality Act in 2010. And they were to eliminate unlawful discrimination, harassment, victimisation, and any other conduct prohibited by the Act. Secondly, to advance equality of opportunity between people who share a protected characteristics and people who do not share it. And three, foster good relations between people who have shared protected characteristics and people who don't have it. Now, in many respects, that's the public side, or the positive action side of equality legislation. The UK doesn't have anything akin to affirmative action, but it has capacity to be proactive, and the general equality duty was seen as that. That leaves open a whole array of areas which I think the Scottish administrations wanted to take focus on. So we have then the introduction of Scottish specific duties, of which I think there were 8. Shall I run through them briefly?
Yes, please do.
So that was, well, firstly, to report on the mainstreaming of the general equality duty, but then to publish equality outcomes and report progress, specifically on the areas devolved to Scotland, you know, health, education, criminal justice, so on. Assess and review policies and practices, gather and use employee information, publish statements on equal pay, consider award criteria and conditions in relation to public procurement, publish in a manner that is accessible, and have a duty on Scottish ministers to publish proposals to enable better performance. So there were 8 Scottish specific duties which were introduced in 2012.
And some of that was about gathering data,
Yeah.
which was then should be made public,
Yeah.
so that academics in universities such as yourself could then analyse that and work with that.
And that the administrations and the authorities themselves should
the
be
authorities.
holding themselves to account
Yeah.
and showing how they're making progress in achieving the objectives they set themselves in the race equality schemes, but also what statutory in terms of being required of them.
So the data could be assessed,
Yes.
it could be monitored,
Yes.
audited,
Yes.
and they could see if they were achieving the goals
Yes.
that this legislation was set out to achieve,
Yes.
and in relation to prohibited characteristics and
Yes.
discrimination
Yes.
against people. And then, so moving on from that, we see at the top of the page, you've talked about the public sector equality duty. You've talked today in your evidence about general duties. We've heard about a public sector equality duty. Is that the same type of thing?
Yes. Yes.
And then you've talked about the Scottish specific duties. I see in 2011, however, just before that entry on your timeline, that there is mention of Simon San. And I'm interested in that. I think you talk about that on page 11 of the body of your report, at paragraph 1.5.6. And you say that a decade after the Jandu inquiry, a complaint inquiry in 2011 identified a collective failing in Lothian and Borders Police with respect to the improper investigation of a fatal violent attack on a 40-year-old man of Chinese origin, Simon San, and that was in 2010. You say specifically the complaint inquiry concluded in discounting that the attack had a racial motivation. Despite evidence of racist language used by perpetrators, Lothian and Borders Police failed to recognise that the attack on Simon was racist, and that this was not only at the outset of the investigation, but also as it progressed throughout the investigation. And you talked a moment ago about the Chokar murder and the absence of an investigation into racial motivation. Is this something that was also noticed in the Simon San
Yes.
investigation? Again, an absence of investigation into racial motivation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And in many respects, it's a repetition of precisely that issue.
But these are 10 years apart.
They are, and the recommendations of the Macpherson inquiry have been adopted in between. Sometimes it's been said, unpersuasively to my mind, that Choker was pre-Macpherson. Whatever else you might say about the case of Simon San, it wasn't that.
As I understand your timeline, and if we can go back to the previous page, the Scottish Parliament endorsed the Macpherson definition. The report's out by then in 1999.
Yes.
And the inquiries into the death of Mr. Chokar were 2001.
Yes. But Mr. Choker was murdered in 1998. Yeah.
So, in relation to the distinction, however, between those who say Mr. Chokar died before Macpherson, what significance is that?
Because of the emphasis the Macpherson inquiry report put on any racist incident being an incident which is perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person, including the family.
And again, you mention this in your report, paragraph 1.5.6. You say, the police, despite the police service in Scotland having adopted the Macpherson definition of a racist incident, and that was prior to the death of Mr. San, and that being a racist incident being any incident which is perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person. And that actually came from Macpherson.
It did, yes.
And that was from 1999.
Yes.
So according to the recommendations and views in the Macpherson report, any incident perceived to be racist by the victim or any other person should be treated as a racist incident.
It should at least be investigated as such,
Investigated as a racist incident. And that was a definition that the police service in Lothian and Borders at that time had actually endorsed.
Yes, yes.
But in relation to Simon San's death, there was an absence of investigation into racial motivation?
Yes, an absence of investigation into specifically that issue, a lack of resource allocated to the investigation, a relatively junior investigating officer. I think it was maybe their first case, in fact. Such that the Deputy Chief Constable, Constable Allen, recognised these issues and apologised to Simon San's family for these failings. Yeah.
In terms of this, we have the Scottish Parliament endorsing Macpherson. We have Lothian and Borders Police, as you say, adopting the definition of a racist incident. We have the experience of Chokar and the reports that came out. 10 years later,
Yes.
there's the death of Mr. San. Despite these public proclamations and endorsements and acceptances, there's no actual investigation. I'm interested in this mismatch between what's being said and the reality in relation to the investigation. Was that addressed in public in relation to the Lothian and Borders investigation into Mr. San?
No, there was an apology for the failings, but there wasn't a discernible course of action which would rule out repetition or would persuade the stakeholders involved that a path was being pursued that would ensure a similar outcome wouldn't happen again.
How can that be avoided, where things are accepted publicly and endorsed and adopted, but when it comes to another situation arising, nothing's changed?
Yeah, well, this slightly takes us back to Scarman and precisely his disappointment with the lack of implementation. And the conversation we had at the beginning when we were talking about the Anti-Racism Observatory, to some extent it may reflect that loss of institutional knowledge which comes with the movement of people, but these things should remain independent of people. That these are commitments undertaken, they're statutory obligations, there's learning which has been adopted, yet there still seems a recalcitrance almost to take seriously the issues which help explain why they occurred in the first instance. That racism, racist violence isn't as serious a matter, and certainly not as serious enough to be taken into consideration when planning and undertaking an investigation.
So not enough that individuals are enthusiastic in implementing change, but that to avoid the loss of institutional knowledge, if people are ill or retire or move to different jobs, there should be some structural...
Yes, absolutely. And I think what I'm saying is a bit stronger, which is it's not a benign loss, an accidental loss. I think there has been a willful resistance to it, because it goes hand in hand with recognizing the systemic nature of a problem. Back to that term, system. You know.
Can you help the chair understand why there's a resistance to this change?
Well, I mean, I think nobody likes to work in a profession where they feel collective responsibility. But of course, that's what we do when we work in the public sector. I think people who work in these organizations feel that the charge of racism is inflated, and so they need to guard against it where possible. And in the accounts that are detailed in the report, it's very hard not to come away with that sense that there's a real systemic reticence to understand that racism isn't just the problem of one or two people or one or two incidents, but it's actually broader than that. It requires remaking how organizations work, including how they engage with communities, and not least the communities and the families of people who are the subject of racist violence. That it should be a priority in investigating these instances.
So leaving matters in the hands of one or two individual champions doesn't address this issue about the loss of institutional knowledge and the ongoing maintenance of commitment to these issues being resolved properly.
No, it doesn't. For the same reasons that Scarman identified as feeling that his reforms hadn't taken hold, that there has to be senior leadership on this, and it has to be sustained in a way in which will continue after people move on.
Thank you. Continuing on with this, sorry, can we go back to the next slide? Now, it's not identified on this particular timeline, but in 2017, we've already mentioned, you looked at the report by Lady Angelini in relation to deaths in custody. And you've dealt with that on page 11 of your report at 157, and we'll look at that in a moment. But you've explained, I think, yes, and you've footnoted Lady Angelini's report. And was that another significant moment in this particular timeline?
It was, absolutely, because it was something which established the nature of a problem which rested not with the families of the victims, but something which needs to be taken up and operationalised, at high levels in government and so on. The recommendations in that report were really quite wide-ranging. I don't know how many were adopted and how many are yet to be and what their status is. When I try to find the information on this, it's not always clear what's been taken up and what's yet to be taken up, and how what has been taken up has shifted or altered processes.
And in relation to what you've described in the period between Macpherson and San, adoption is only one part of that.
Yeah.
I think you've explained that it's the implementation of those recommendations, not simply the adoption of them or the endorsing of those, that is a vital step in the process.
Well, again, it depends what implementation means. I mean, you can implement things, as Scarman observed, some of his reforms were implemented, but not in a way that was sustained. They can be implemented in a way in which is a surface level reform, without changing or altering the culture of the organisation. And they can be implemented in ways in which show that they have been considered but not resourced.
So change costs money.
It does. And it's hard. It's uncomfortable. It's unsettling. And I think that discomfort and that resource investment, are part of the ways in which I think organisations don't change.
And that's perhaps a reason why people say we've not got the money to implement these changes. And that's why things don't change.
Yeah. It's part of it, I think.
Part of the picture.
Yeah.
Then we see that you've also acknowledged the announcement by the Scottish Government that this particular inquiry would be established. And you've got that on the timeline in 2019. And then you move on from there to more recent times. I think this particular timeline ends with Hamza Yousaf. but obviously things have moved on. We now have John Swinney as the First Minister, but in particular on the 25th of May 2023 last year, there was an announcement by the Chief Constable of Police Scotland in relation to institutional racism that we hope to hear about at some point.
Yes. Yes.
And would you say that was another significant matter where there was a recognition by Police Scotland of institutional racism?
Very much so, and it's discussed in the report. I should have added it to the timeline now
Yeah.
that you mention it, yes.
Yes. Right, thank you. Could you give me a moment, please? I'm conscious it's now 1 o'clock.
We'll stop for lunch now instead of 2 o'clock.